Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's production of How the Word is Passed with Clint Smith. I'm Rebecca Roberts. I'm the curator of programming at Planet Word, Museum of Words and Language in downtown Washington, D.C. We're in the historic Franklin School, which is that beautiful building behind me in my virtual Zoom background. If you haven't had a chance to visit us in person, we are open Thursday through Sunday, 10 to 5. And if you are here in Washington and ready to come to museums, we are eager to have you. Admission to the museum is free. We do have a suggested donation. If you see that the advance tickets are all reserved already, don't let that dissuade you. We do always welcome walk-ups to the museum. If you know about this program because you're already a member of Planet Word and are already involved with Planet Word, thank you so much for your ongoing support of our mission and our programming. Your support is how we're able to bring you programs like this one, keep admission to the museum free. And I hope that if you are not a member, but are enjoying our programming, you would consider becoming one. Go to planetwordmuseum.org. There's a lot of different levels of membership, and it'll all tell you what all of those levels entail. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which is how you'll find out about programming. We've got some exciting announcements in the museum coming up this spring. Newsletter and following us on social media are the ways to find out about those things first. So I am delighted to welcome Clint Smith. The book is How the Word is Passed. That tends to disappear when I have a virtual background up there. But you know, Clint, we originally were going to talk to you last June when the book was first published, but I am delighted actually for the delay because since then, it's gotten so much recognition. I think it was on everybody's best books of 2021 list, including President Obama's, and you know, longlisted for the National Book Award and PEN America. So congratulations, enormously well deserved.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't get to do it originally in June, but it's been a remarkable several months. I mean, more than I could have ever dreamed of, more than any writer could hope to imagine. So I think I'm still pinching myself in so many ways. The whole experience is sort of strange because it's all happened like right here in this Zoom setup.
Right.
Like I think I've only had 2 in-person events in the last 2 years in that brief window of post Delta vaccine, or maybe it was whenever there was vaccine and Delta hadn't come, and then there was like before Omicron came. So hopefully, you know, we're moving toward that, because I as much as this has been convenient in some ways, especially we talked about, I have 2 young kids, and it's nice to be able to do an event and then put them to bed. But you know, it's nothing is the same as being in the room with readers and people who have read your work or thought about your work and put your work in conversation with other books they read. There's nothing like being in bookstores and in, you know, places like Planet Word. So I'm hopeful that I can get a second chance with the paperback coming out in June.
Yeah. Well, also, I think that it's not like the themes that you discuss and write about are going to expire in some way. I think it's going to have a nice long life. You know, so you're on the Planet Word Advisory Board. You first came into our orbit, planet pun, as the slam poetry champion. And I saw an interview you gave about this book where you said you actually originally conceived of it as a book of poetry. How did it turn into narrative nonfiction?
Yeah, so for folks who might not be as familiar with my work, my first book was a collection of poetry. It is Counting Descent. It came out in 2016, and I thought that this would be my second book of poetry. You know, the origin story of this book is that in 2017, I was watching some Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans. So statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And I was watching these statues come down, and I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. And my middle school was named after the leader of the Confederacy, that my parents still live on the street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that's not to say that taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it is to say that all of these things help us understand the ecosystem of ideas and narratives and stories that shape how we understand history, and thus how we understand which groups of people have been harmed throughout American history, to better understand why our society looks the way that it does today. And so I was looking around New Orleans, thinking about, well, how does my own city, whether through its iconography, through its museums, through the infrastructure, what have you, how does it reckon with or fail to reckon with its own relationship to the history of slavery? And then I started thinking about different places across the country and how are they reckoning with or failing to reckon with that history. And I thought at first that it would be a collection of poems in which each poem, the conceit of the book would be that each poem was about a statue in New Orleans, right? And so I would, go and examine all of these different statues and think about what they mean, think about, because how my relationship to them evolved, because I remember the PGT Beauregard statue as the statue that for me as a child was synonymous with feeding the ducks at City Park, right? Because it's the statue at the front of our big park. And so growing up in some sort of interesting, perverse way, I had fond memories when I think of seeing that statue, because it was so deeply associated with, spending time at the park with my family, with my mom, climbing oak trees, Spanish moss tickling my ankles. It was this really beautiful set of memories associated with the iconography of a man who, fought a war to keep us from ever being able to experience those things. So that I was interested in that sort of juxtaposition. And poetry for me is the mechanism through which I create art, but also through which I do my best thinking, right? Like I don't really journal, but I write a lot of poems. Most of the poems that I write are never seen by the world because poetry is kind of me working through a set of questions. And when I started to think about these questions, I was using poetry as the mechanism through which to think about them. And then I kind of realized that what I was trying to get at through all these poems I was writing, I realized that what I was trying to get at needed a little bit more room to breathe. And so I started writing these kind of longer reflective essays, these sort of meditative essays on these different places in New Orleans. And I started doing these longer essays on different places that I had visited outside of New Orleans. And then I remember the first chapter of the book is about Monticello. And Monticello, as many know, is the home of Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, one of our founding fathers. And I remember being at Monticello and going on this tour with a guy named David Thorson. And David was one of the docents at Monticello, and he leads the Slavery at Monticello tour. And he gave this sort of 45-minute masterclass of the sort of cognitive dissonance of Jefferson's intellectual project, right? How Jefferson is someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, and is also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. How he wrote in one document that all men are created equal, and wrote in another document that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. And so, David is doing an incredible job laying out these contradictions. And I was watching these 2 women, Donna and Grace, who were on the tour with me, and you could see their faces sort of wilting and their mouths kind of hung agape as David was saying, outlining Jefferson's relationship to slavery. And I went up to them after and I was like, I'd love to hear some more about how this impacted you. And Donna was like, man, he really took the shine off the guy. She was like, I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation. These are folks who rented plane tickets, got hotel rooms, and came to this site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, and had no idea that he was an enslaver, had no idea that hundreds of people over the course of generations have been enslaved on this plantation. And that moment was so important for me as a writer, because it made me recognize that this book couldn't only be my own reflections of my experiences at these places. It had to be in conversation with the experience of other people as they experience these places, right? It's this sort of triangulation of, my experience at these places, other individuals' experiences at these places, and in conversation with the sort of historical documents and the archives and the work of academic historians. And so that's kind of the evolution of it, right? Where it went from, this is probably over the course of a year and a half that it evolved in that way, because I was writing poems and I was writing the essays, and then it just and it took a while to get to what I realized was going to be the first chapter of the book. I probably wrote like 30,000 words before I got to the first word. Um, so even before I started the book, a lot was left on the cutting room floor. But I, especially when I talk to young writers or young people who are interested in writing, I always say like that's what it means to be a writer. Most of the stuff you write is never seen by the world, but you need to write it in order to get to the thing that you're actually trying to write.
Hmm. Well, I would say that your poet's soul definitely comes through, not just because the writing is so evocative and sensory, and we don't just hear about what David Larson is saying. We know how he looks and how the sun shines off his head, and how it smells and feels there. But I would say the other way it really comes through is with your sort of generosity of spirit. You weren't there to correct Donna and Grace. You weren't there to tell them that they were doing something wrong. You were there to understand their story and what brought them there, and how they had this very different understanding of history than you did.
Yeah, that's very kind of you to say. I mean, I think I I wanted to model the book and the sensibilities of the book off of the guides and the docents that I met in many ways. I think whether it's David at Monticello or Yvonne at Whitney or Norris at Angola or Damaris in New York, I kept encountering these people who would extend this incredible grace and generosity to folks who came to these sites or where they were spending time with, and saying, they weren't condescending, they weren't going to judge somebody for not knowing this, some information when they showed up somewhere. But there was also, while there was generosity and grace, there was also a sense of accountability and responsibility,
Mhm.
right? Which is to say, like, I'm not going to judge you for not knowing this information when you show up here, but when I present you with this information, you have a responsibility to sit with it, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it threatens, calls into question, your very ideas of what this country is, and thus who you are in relationship to this country. I know a woman at Monticello, Teresa, I think, another docent, outlined it really well. She said, people come here and when they hear us challenging Jefferson, we think we're challenging them, or when they think we're tearing down Jefferson, we think we're trying to tear them down, because so much of our ideas of who we are tied to a sort of myth that has been propagated about this country, and specifically white Americans. And so it can be difficult for them to disentangle themselves from those stories. But, and so part of it is that part of it, this book is in so many ways an ode to those docents and public historians and tour guides who I just think are doing such important, remarkable work. And the other part of it, is, I guess part of it is my disposition. I'm just a curious person. I just want to know. I mean, it's interesting because I make a living in part as a journalist now, as a staff writer at The Atlantic. But when I was writing this book, it's funny because the reviews are like, poet and journalist Clint Smith goes on this tour across the country. And I read them like, who's a journalist? I'm like, who are they talking about? Because I didn't go to journalism school. I've never worked for a media or newspaper or magazine or anything before this. I did some freelancing, but this is still a relatively new thing. But so I didn't think of myself as reporting when I was doing it. I was just curious, and I was just asking questions. And I know that if you ask someone a question and then try to make them feel bad about what they say, or if you try to antagonize them, or if you try to do a sort of game of gotcha, then they're not going to be honest with you, right? Like, I mean, I could have written, done that, but it would be a very different book. When I go to Blandford Cemetery and I'm with the Sons of Confederate Veterans, I could approach it in an antagonistic way, or I could just listen to what they believe the truth to be, and then let the primary source documents and the historical evidence, do the talking. Like, it doesn't always have to be me, and I'm not trying to prove anything to anybody, as much as just understand how this really diverse group of people across the country think about these questions that I've been thinking about.
I've heard you quoted saying that part of what poetry has taught you is to pay attention, which I think journalists would also say. But it's a little bit risky, your model. You don't know who else is going to be on the tour. You don't know if the docent's going to be any good. You don't know if it's going to be pouring rain,
Yeah, absolutely.
so you left a lot of wild cards out there.
Yeah, the whole book was a wild card. It's funny 'cause somebody was asking me about like nonfiction book proposals the other day, and I don't know what the experience is like for everybody else. Well, I know a little bit about what it's like for other people, but you write it. I wrote I was working on a book proposal from 2017 to 2018. We sold the book in, I think, October of 2018 to Little Brown, and when you write a nonfiction book proposal, for those who aren't familiar with publishing, especially if it's your first time, you have to, there's this extensive outline of what the book is about. You're outlining what the different chapters are. You're saying, in this book, I was like, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here, I'm going to talk to this person, I'm going to talk to this person. You provide a sample chapter, and you're writing all this, and like, you don't know who you're going to talk to. You like, maybe you know where you're going to go, but like, you have no idea who you're going to see when you go. I mean, so you're kind of like saying things and hoping it's true. You're like, I'm gonna go here and talk to this. You're just like, I'm Googling people. I'm like, oh, that would be good to put in here. And the nature of this project, you're right, is one that, so I say that because the finished product is, for any nonfiction book, especially one like this that relies so much on going places and talking to people and not actually knowing who you're going to encounter when you go there. You just don't know. You don't know where the book's going to take you. For example, like, I never, one of the most central chapters of the book is the Confederate cemetery. But I had no notion of ever going to the Confederate cemetery. That was not something I put in my proposal. That was not something that was even on my mind. I thought I was going to write a chapter on Civil War battlefields. And so I went to the Civil War battlefield in Petersburg, Virginia, where the siege of Petersburg was happening toward the end of the Civil War. And I was, on a tour and talking to this National Park Service ranger and telling him a little bit about my project. And he was like, oh, you should go to this Confederate cemetery down the road. And I was like, Confederate cemetery? I don't know, man. He was like, it sounds like it'd be a really good match for you. And I was like, all right, it's down the road. Let me see. And then I went to the Confederate cemetery. I was the only person there. And then I went on this tour, and I was like, it's interesting. I'm at this Confederate cemetery and nobody's saying anything about the Confederacy. And we're just talking about how beautiful the windows are. And then I go into the visitor center, and the woman I'm speaking with, sees me see a pile of flyers that have an event publicizing the Sons of Confederate Veterans Memorial Day event. And then she flips the flyers over to try to hide it from me. And so as a writer, you have these moments sometimes where you're like, oh, the story is telling me where it's trying to take me. Right. And so there is no context in which I would have written in my book proposal, I'm going to go spend the day with the Sons of Confederate Veterans in Virginia to understand the lost cause. Like, that's not something that I, as a person, would do generally. But it's also the thing I love about a project like this. You never know where it's going to take you. And the other part of it is that the places that I ended up writing, I visited dozens of places and only ended up writing about some of the places in the book, because sometimes you would go to a place and you have an experience that maybe wasn't worth writing about, but also one that informed how you made sense of another place you went. Right. So I've been to many prisons and jails, but Angola allows you to tell a story about slavery's relationship to our current carceral state in a way that you don't have to go, I don't have to also write about Parchment Prison. I don't also have to write about, a prison in Alabama. I can use a place as a sort of microcosm for a larger set of themes and questions that might arise from other places. So yeah, I think often about the kind of like the serendipity of it all sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I'm a big believer in, I don't know if believer is the right word, but like this idea of chaos theory, and just like that your life is a series of, like, if I do this one thing differently, it's the butterfly effect. Like, if you do this one thing, it shifts the trajectory of your life in all sorts of ways. And so I think, if I had like stopped to go to the bathroom on my way to Monticello and was late for the tour, I wouldn't have had David as a tour guide. I would have had somebody else, right? And then the entire trajectory of that chapter looks different. right? I wouldn't have met Donna and Grace. I wouldn't have met David. I wouldn't have met. So, and that's the case at all of these places. I mean, the
Mhm.
final one version of that too is that I was finishing my reporting in New York like 10 days before uh, COVID hit. And I was telling my wife, I was like, I think I need to go to New York this weekend to like go on this walking tour. And mind you, we had 2 kids, and so like I was risking a lot of marriage capital.
Right, right. That's a big
Well,
ask.
it was a big ask I was like, let me go to New York this weekend, and can you watch the 2-year-old and the baby? So I went into marriage debt for a little while, but it ended up working out because the country is shut down after that, and I feel very lucky that I was able to finish all my reporting um, before that happened. But again, I mean, you never know.
And, I think that the Bedford Cemetery is a great example, because even if you had put that in your book proposal, that you were going to go spend a day with the Sons of the Confederacy, that moment when she flips over the brochures, I mean,
Mm,
that woman was so profoundly uncomfortable with having this conversation with a Black person.
yeah,
She didn't, she had no idea what to do with you. And that is the kind of moment that you can't possibly plan for.
yeah.
But also doesn't come through as well to the reader in the hands of a different writer. So it's the serendipity of circumstance, but also handled with your particular way with words and sensitivity. Um, I want to talk a little bit about Louisiana. New Orleans is your hometown. The statues coming down New Orleans was one of your inspirations. You also then, you said, Angola could stand for a lot of other prisons, but Angola's in Louisiana too.
Mhm.
And the Whitney Plantation, of course. Um, was that intentional? Did you want to ground some of this story in where you came from personally?
Yeah, I mean the book, sort of the sort of recent origin story is what I said at the beginning with the monuments, but and I kind of allude to this at the end of the book, but I wrote this book because I felt like I grew up and had never been given the language or the framework or the tools or the history with which to understand why the city I grew up in looked the way that it did today. Or and I just remember you grow up and you're told New Orleans is the murder capital of the nation. It incarcerates more people per capita than China, Iran, and Russia. It's this place of violence and poverty, and the public housing projects represent this cultural depravity, and a lot of things that are implicitly talking about Black people, given that New Orleans, especially then, was very much a majority Black city, and you're being inundated with these messages, some implicit, some explicit, about all the things that are wrong with your city, all the things that are wrong with Black people in your city. And I felt like I didn't have again, like I said, just didn't have the language with which to push back against it. And so the insidiousness of white supremacy is that it inundates you with these messages. And if you don't have the language and history with which to protect yourself from it, then you start to internalize some of those messages, start to get
How can you
confused.
not? Right.
And I think that that's what happens to young people all the time, right? In all sorts of contexts. It happens to adults too. And so this book was me attempting to like fill in the gaps of my own childhood, right? Me attempting, first and foremost, I always tell people, like, I wanted to write a book that I wanted to write the sort of book that I felt like I needed when I was 16 in my American history class. The sort of book that would have helped me look around New Orleans and understand that the reason one part of New Orleans looks one way and one part of New Orleans looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but because of what has been done to those communities generation after generation after generation. Um, and and that was, when I think of who the audience for this book is, it was that. It was like a high school Clint. Um, and it was setting out to answer some of those questions that he had, and I think that that naturally led me to um, center a lot of my attention on New Orleans and Louisiana and places that both physically, geographically and emotionally, felt close to home.
Well, it's interesting that, you say you were working on the proposal and thinking it through 2017, 2018. Then in the process of it being published and being out for the last 6, 7 months, this conversation has already changed so many times, right? You had the memorials coming down, but then you had, the summer of 2020 and Black Lives Matter and people talking about systemic racism on a national scale that hadn't happened for a while. And now you've got state legislatures actively passing legislation, keeping teachers from educating students about slavery, keeping white people from having to confront an uncomfortable part of American history. And that has all been in the last 18 months.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you never know when your book is going to come out. Like obviously 3 years ago when I, finished the proposal, 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when I was thinking about these questions in earnest, I couldn't have planned that my book would come out in like critical race theory summer.
Right.
It's just not.
Who could have predicted there would be such a thing as critical race theory summer?
And I feel, as you mentioned at the beginning, there's never going to be a time when this isn't relevant, because this history is with us forever. I'm hopeful that I've written something that can contribute to, a really remarkable and robust historiography, body of literature, to help people make sense of this history. This book is not written by someone who began this project as an expert on the history of slavery. It's written by somebody who realized that I didn't understand the history of slavery in any way that is commensurate with the impact that it had on this country. In many, to a different degree, but not so different than Donna and Grace, right? I was constantly confronting information. I was reading these historians. I was reading, Ira Berlin. I was reading David Bryan Davis. I was reading Leslie Harris. I was reading Dinah Rainey Berry, Annette Gordon Reed, Walter Johnson, Vincent Brown, all of these incredible historians whose work has transformed my understanding of that period of time and of our country. And just constantly confronting information, I was like, I had no idea. It was, this whole book, the process of writing this whole book was either like reading something or going to a place where somebody told me something. And I was like, why didn't I learn this in my 8th grade history class? Why didn't I learn this in AP US history? Why didn't I? And I wanted, and that was intentional, both because it's true, but I also wanted the reader to feel like they were on this journey alongside me, not only in terms of, giving them a sort of as cinematic a view of the places we were, right? Because as the poet in me, the thing that I loved most about this book in so many ways was just like writing these scenes in as much detail as I could, right? Like writing about how the sun, struck David's forehead, writing about the sound of the wind as, inside the slave cabin, writing about what it smelled like when I stepped inside, Jefferson's home, all these different things to really create a sort of novelistic feel, right? Like when I read my favorite novels, what it makes you feel like is you are there with that protagonist, with these characters. And I wanted this book to feel to be a history book that felt like a novel in some ways, in which I'm the protagonist and you're following me on this journey across the country. So yeah, it was really important for me to make sure that the reader felt like they were with me and seeing things alongside me rather than like me sort of telling people, oh, you should have known this before, or like you should have always known this, because I didn't, and so that would be not only disingenuous, but I think like a much less interesting or generous read.
Well, I also think that being able to feel it and picture it underscores how recent the history is. I think specifically at Whitney Plantation, it felt that way, that this is recent history. You talk about your grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. It just wasn't that long ago, but also it's physically close. And I haven't been to the Whitney Plantation. I don't know how many people in our audience have. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about it, because that was the place where it felt to me as a reader, like I was really with you discovering something that felt very powerful.
Yeah, so the Whitney is one of the only plantations in the country, the only plantation museum in Louisiana, and one of the only plantation museums in the country that focuses the story it tells of itself singularly on the perspectives and lives of the enslaved people who were held there. And so, it exists as part of this, surrounded by like this constellation of plantations in Louisiana, where people continue to hold weddings and, you know, debutante balls and formal ceremonies and get-togethers and all sorts of events that are, meant predicated on celebration and joy and happiness. And the Whitney fundamentally rejects the idea that a plantation can be understood as anything other than an intergenerational site of torture and exploitation, right? They and their curatorial process is meant to give you an intimate sense of what slavery was like through the perspective of children, through the perspective of women, through the perspective of rebellions and resistance that took place in the 1811 slave revolt, which was the largest slave revolt in American history. It doesn't often get the same level of attention as some of the other revolts, but it was numbers wise the largest slave revolt in US history. And I think that, the Federal Writers Project, the slave narratives are a really important part of that curatorial process. It's these narratives that were done, interviews that were done between 1936 and 1938 with formerly enslaved people who were still alive. So these are people who were children when slavery ended, and when they're being interviewed, they're in there.
It was part of the WPA, yeah.
Part of the WPA, it's part of the New Deal. And they ended up doing over 2,300 interviews, and so many of those stories are incorporated in the exhibitions at the Whitney. And I think they do it really effectively because slavery is stripped of the idea that it's an abstraction, right? Because it's real people telling you stories, and not only real people, but like ordinary people, not Frederick Douglass, not Harriet Tubman, not Olaudah Equiano, not Harriet Jacobs, whose work is remarkable and we should absolutely study it. I think Frederick Douglass is like one of the most remarkable humans to ever exist in the world. Same with Harriet Tubman and the like. But I think there's something to be said for understanding slavery not through the perspective of people who escaped, or people who learned to read and write, or were these exceptional, remarkable abolitionists, but ordinary people who were trying to carve out a sense of purpose and meaning for their lives in the midst of circumstances that are unfathomable to most of us, right? Like part of what the Whitney really made me think of was this sort of psychological terror and torture that was omnipresent through slavery. And I, when I started this book, we had my son, and then in the middle of it, we had my daughter. And when I was at the Whitney, I remember having a moment and thinking about how for so long slavery, the way I thought about slavery was deeply, the sort of image I had of slavery was tied to like physical brutality. It's like somebody being beaten, somebody being whipped. And that is certainly a part of slavery. But I didn't always think about family separation in the same, like it wasn't at the forefront of my consciousness when I thought about the institution. But I think having a family and having my kids of my own changed that, because I went to Whitney and I was just thinking about what would it mean if I went to sleep in my home, and when I woke up, my kids were gone. And I had no idea where they went. I had no idea who had taken them. I had no idea if I would ever see them again. And it's like you can't even, it's difficult to even emotionally complete the thought exercise because it's so devastating,
Unthinkable, right?
Unfathomable to consider. And yet this is the reality that millions of people lived under every single day for 250 years, that you could be taken away from the people you love, from your husband, from your wife, from your kids, from your parents, from your community, that at any moment they could be taken away from you, you could be taken away from them. And it just really transformed my understanding of how slavery was. It was a system of physical torture, but there's also this sort of way that the threat of separation from people you love can be constantly be wielded as a weapon to keep you from rebelling, to keep you from running away, to keep, because you could say like, "Oh, I feel physically like I could get away," but if you do, you don't know what they're going to do to your parents, or you don't know what they're going to. So right, so the very threat and the very possibility that something might happen to you might be separated from, or that something might happen to the people you love, becomes really is made really transparent at the Whitney in a way that I think is really effective.
You know, we sort of talk about grappling with this history in the abstract, but of course, most of us do have a personal history as well. And you know, you talk about the Sons of the Confederacy that are so invested in a certain narrative that they can't rethink it. They just don't want to shift. I think that actually the more interesting people are the ones who want to shift or admit wrong, but can't quite figure out what to do with that information. And I also, I must admit, I say this as somebody who's one of the names you call out in your New Orleans chapter is W.C.C. Claiborne, who is an ancestor of mine.
Oh, wow.
And you know, you also talk about when you taught high school, and there were Black kids who said, "Oh my, you know, I would have gotten out, I would have escaped," and that they're judging their own ancestors for staying in this oppression.
Yeah.
I'm judging my own ancestors for perpetuating the oppression.
Mm.
Once you've done that, now what do you do, right? Once you've admitted that the narrative you have been taught as the sort of family lore is not accurate or not the whole story, what's your next step?
I mean, I think that in so many ways, that's something that we do in all sorts of contexts, right? I mean, this is, you know, when I go to Blandford, I'm thinking about it in terms of, you know, people's relationship to, you know, American history and race and you know, the war and the Civil War specifically. But in so many ways, like we're always doing this. We're always sort of grappling with the people and the families and the communities we come from, and the values that were, you know, passed down to us from those spaces. And then as we begin to develop our own sense of self and our own sense of values, we are, you know, this is so much of adulthood. This is why people go to therapy, because like you're experiencing that the tension and the cognitive dissonance of like, oh, I grew up and my parents were this religion, but I don't know if I believe that. But also my entire sense of self has been shaped by, you know, the tenets of this religion that I don't know if I believe in. So like, then you have an existential crisis. You're like, well, who am I? What do I believe? It can be in the context of religion. Maybe you had parents who were, you know, xenophobic or homophobic, or had really narrow conceptions around gender and sex and gender identity. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's endless, right? And I think that we're always grappling with how to take the things that from the people we love that we feel like have been formative in ways that are positive, and while at the same time attempting to disentangle ourselves from those parts of our lineage, those parts of our communities, those parts of our histories that we don't feel are aligned with who we are or who we want to be. And that's a hard thing to do, right? You know, it's not an easy thing. You know, one of the things at Blandford, I think about that guy I met named Jeff. And Jeff, when I was talking to him, he was a son of the Confederate veteran, and he was telling me these stories of when his grandfather would bring him to the cemetery, and they would sit in the gazebo at the center of the cemetery, and they would watch the the deer come out of the forest at dusk and watch how the skyline turned from blue to purple to orange to pink, and they would sing songs about old Dixie, and they would sing the old Dixie anthem, and he would tell him these stories about the brave men who were buried in this soil, and they didn't fight a war for slavery, they fought a war to protect their families, protect their loved ones, to save the South. And now Jeff tells those same stories to his granddaughters. And so if you go to Jeff and you're like, you know, your grandfather wasn't telling you the truth, your grandfather was lying to you. This war was very clearly fought over slavery. Look at the Declarations of Confederate Secession. Look at the Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy's cornerstone speech. Look at the Crittenden Amendments before that were an attempt to prevent the Civil War from being fought, which said, if you said to the South, if you stay, we will allow slavery to exist in perpetuity. Nobody will touch it. Don't worry. Like, so we can't understand secession and the Civil War as anything other than being about slavery when it was very clear from the things that the people who were part of it were saying, lays out. But for so many people, history is not about empirical evidence or primary source documents. It's a story that they are told. And it's a story that they tell. It's an heirloom that's passed down across generations. And so if I go to Jeff and I say, but what about the Declaration of Confederate Secession? What about Alexander Stephens' cornerstone speech? That doesn't matter, because if Jeff is to accept that his grandfather was lying to him, if he's to accept that information that I'm telling him, he has to accept that his grandfather was lying to him. If he accepts that his grandfather was lying to him, then it threatens to disintegrate some of the foundation upon which he believes his relationship with this person to be built. And if you disintegrate the foundation upon which somebody's relationship is built with a loved one, then it calls into question who they understand themselves to be, right? Because who they understand themselves to be was so tied to their how this person shaped them. And that is, it's not to say that you shouldn't, like, it's not an excuse. It's not to say like, oh, it's okay, like your granddad told you these stories, you can go ahead and continue to believe the Civil War wasn't about slavery. No, it's not about it not being hard. It's about it being hard and doing it anyway. And again, these are things that we do in all different parts of our lives. And I think that you can, to different degrees and obviously in different contexts, like extend grace and extend generosity and understanding. Like, I know some of the things that I think about some things that I believed 10, 15 years ago that, you know, I would be ashamed to even admit now, right? But it's because of the grace and generosity of people who didn't have to be gracious or generous, and the way that they extended that to me, that allowed me to recognize that, you know, what I believed was wrong or problematic or not fully true, and hopefully allows me to be a better, more empathic person.
Well, also, would you rather be the kind of person who hadn't changed their mind or learned anything new in 15 years, right?
You know, I hope not. I hope not. But it's so I think that we all just have to be, you know, to answer your question more directly, I guess, like, just humble ourselves, right? And just be open to to be open to knowing that there's so much we don't know, and then to pursue that, you know, to the extent that we can, not to be passive and wait for that information to come to us, but to seek it out, you know, and to try to understand more, that, you know, might widen the web of our empathy.
We have lots and lots of audience questions. I want to get to a few of them. As we deal with attempts to whitewash our history in schools and in the public sphere, what advice would you give public historians who are administering sites with difficult history?
Oh man, well, if this person is a public historian, shout out to you, because I love you all. And I just think you do, like, the thing about public historians and docents is that so many, like, what is it? I think 500,000 people visit Monticello every year, or at least they did before the pandemic. I'm not sure what the numbers are now. But like 500,000 people aren't reading any book about slavery, right? Like, it is not, so you have more people who are coming to Donna and Grace, maybe now, but certainly not when they came to Monticello, are not gonna, when they walk into a bookstore, they're not gonna pick up How the Word is Passed. They're not gonna pick up, you know, any book on slavery. That's not the kind of thing they're gonna pick up. But they would go to Monticello because they're interested in Jefferson, which gives David a unique opportunity to, in 45 minutes, share with them something that they might not have sought out themselves. And these historic sites and the folks who work there are serve as such a great entry point for so many people in thinking about this history, and it's so valuable, right? Like, it was an entry point in so many different ways for me. All the different places I went would, I'd come back and like try to read as many books as I could about the place that I went, or the people, and the stories that I heard, and the historical characters who manifested themselves. So advice to public historians, I mean, I think the things that from the public historians that I saw are the things that I hope all public historians will do, which is that both andedness of grace and generosity, but also accountability and responsibility.
Mhm.
It's not about judging people for what they don't know, but it is about holding people accountable for the information when they're presented with it.
Someone asks, you talked about how this book evolved from a book of poetry to a nonfiction novel of sorts. Did you ever consider it as a work of fiction? The way you're talking about telling the story of people who, by the nature of their story, couldn't tell it, makes me think of Octavia Butler's Kindred, which was so powerful in its visceral connection to the realities of slavery, almost made more so by its fictive genre.
I mean, I love that my name is anywhere near Octavia Butler's. That's an honor. I mean, I never thought about the book as fiction in the traditional sense, because it had to be true, right? Like there have been too many nonfiction writers who made stuff up and then and then had bad things happen to them. This book was thoroughly fact checked over the course of many months, and I wanted to make sure that every single thing in it was true, right, and could be backed up. I've seen how other projects have been undermined by one sentence that is misinterpreted or unclear, and I just I didn't want, to the extent that I can, and it hasn't happened yet, doesn't mean it won't happen. I wanted as much as possible to guard and shield myself from folks saying that saying something that pointing out something, like whether it's an incorrect date or me making a claim rather than hedging a claim, that would potentially threaten the integrity of the whole project. So I thought, so I didn't think of it as, I wasn't ever thinking like I should just make some stuff up like it was a novel, but like I said, I wanted it to feel novelistic. I brought the things that I've learned from the novelists I love, the Jhumpa Lahiris and the Mohsin Hamids and the Yaa Gysis and the Robert Joneses and the Toni Morrisons, obviously, and so many folks who write really prose that knocks me out of my socks, and I tried to bring those same literary sensibilities to this book. I wanted it to feel both like a book of history and like a novel. I wanted it to be, or not a book of history and a piece of literature, because I think sometimes Black writers can only have their work understood through a sort of anthropological prism, like what is this book teaching me? And doesn't always, and we're all, one way to say it is like we're always on the diversity panel, but not always the craft panel, and I think it's important. I wanted to create something intellectually rigorous, but also aesthetically beautiful, and that felt really important to me.
I should also say I listened to the book, the audiobook, a lot in addition to reading it. And for those of you who have participated in other Planet Word programs, you know that I'm a huge consumer of audiobooks and a big snob about narrators. Clint Smith narrates his own book. And if you can listen to a slam poetry champion read his own incredibly image-heavy, evocative prose, do it every time. It was a really wonderful way to experience this book.
Thank you. That's a long time to have me in your headphones, but
yeah, yeah, we spent a lot of time together last summer. We have a couple of questions about how you chose the locations, and what site might have resonated with you most personally or surprised you the most.
It's hard. It's like picking your children. Um, I mean, I would say that Angola s- probably stuck with me the most and was most surprising in some ways. Just because I've worked in prisons for several years as a teacher. I wrote my dissertation on prisons and specifically prison education. Um, I've been interviewing people in and out of prison for the last 7 years. I did my PhD thinking about these questions and thinking about incarceration. And so I felt when I went to Angola, I was like, oh, well, I think about these things all the time. I've been working in prisons and jails for a long time. Like, I know what to expect. And I just don't, I, I was not, I thought I was prepared and I wasn't emotionally for what I was going to experience. I had never been to death row. Um, I had never been in an execution chamber. I had never been in a place where I saw Black men working in fields of what was once a plantation, picking crops while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And, this sort of the parallels between the history of the institution and the contemporary manifestations of mass incarceration were so unsettling. It says, this scholar Saidiya Hartman talks about it as the afterlife of slavery, how slavery continues to shape our social, political, and economic infrastructure. And we see that most directly, perhaps, through our carceral infrastructure. And it was just so, and I think being there with Norris Henderson, for those who've read the book, you know how dynamic a character and a person Norris is, who's somebody who was incarcerated at Angola for almost 30 years, who I was there with. And I remember when he looked at his hands while we were on the bus, while we were seeing these men in the distance with their garden hose lifted up into the air as they dug them into the earth. And he was looking at his hands, they had these calluses. And he was like, Clint, I can't tell you what it felt like to work in fields for 7 cents an hour picking cotton in the same fields that your ancestors might have picked cotton in 200 years ago. And in the people who have been held there, just they feel that history viscerally in their bodies. And I think I could have written a whole book just about Angola. There's so much to say about it.
Mm-hmm. And talk about cognitive dissonance. Then it's exit through the gift shop, right?
Yeah. I mean, not only is it a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men and 70% of them are serving life sentences, and it is built on top of a former plantation, but it also has a gift shop where people can buy shot glasses and coffee mugs and sweatshirts and t-shirts and baseball caps and the stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And on some of the items, like on a shot glass you can buy it has the silhouette of a watchtower, and above and below the watchtower it says Angola, a gated community. And like as if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of the thousands of people who are incarcerated there today. So yeah, I think if I had to pick one that has stayed with me the most, I would say Angola, in part because I had not expected to be so emotionally taken aback when I went there.
We have a question from someone who says, as a Black woman, I struggle with using founding fathers because I feel like it erases some of the evil that Thomas Jefferson and et cetera committed and shows them in a shining light. What word or words can we use instead of founding father for people like Jefferson and Washington?
That's interesting. I guess I don't think of founding father as a term that denotes something positive specifically, but maybe that's because I'm always thinking about that group of people as inherently complex and full of moral contradictions and ethically dubious positions. You could call them founders. I mean, there's a whole school of thought, where people think of, argue that Frederick Douglass is one of the founding fathers, right? Or that our country wasn't even a democracy until 1965 after the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, right? And that we've only been an actual democracy for 55 or so years at this point. So if I'd say if you don't like saying founding fathers, you definitely don't have to. You can say founders, you can say those guys over there, you can say those folks in that, you know, super hot, sweaty Philadelphia building that
In those snazzy knee breeches, right? Whatever you need to say.
yeah, I personally, for me, the term founding fathers is less, like, finding an alternate term for it is less important than making sure that we name who they were and what they stood for holistically, and don't, to the person's point, assume that because they created the American experiment that that they were inherently good people.
We are out of time, but I actually want to read something you tweeted today. Because it's the first day of Black History Month, which is not why you're here, but coincidentally. You wrote, Black History Month is a time where educators should take seriously the history of violence and oppression that have been done to Black people, but also make clear that Black life is not singularly defined by that violence. The story of Black life is far more expansive than that. And I think that is sort of a wonderful way to end. And I think it's a wonderful way to look at history in general. Don't shy away from the ugliness. Understand the profound and lasting impact of the ugliness, but do not confine yourself to the ugliness.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it is, as I say in that thread, it's the sort of both andness of Black life, right? That you have to hold that complexity together. We are a group of people who have experienced centuries of state-sanctioned oppression in ways that few other groups in the history of the world ever have. You know, obviously there are different iterations of this throughout the world, but it is unique and should be understood as a uniquely horrific and insidious thing that continues to shape what our country looks like today. And like, how remarkable is it that in spite of all of that, like, Black folks are still here and are still contributing what we are, and are still, have created, have truly created the foundation upon which American arts and culture, is grounded, have, just contribute to this world and to our own communities in endless remarkable ways. And I just think that the same way that when we tell the story of Jefferson, you can't tell the story of Jefferson as philosopher or statesman or president or governor or scientist without also telling the story of him as an enslaver. So many of these stories of American history demand that both and rather than the either or approach. And we should all lean in to that complexity instead of run from it.
Well, Clint Smith, it's been a pleasure to spend an hour with you. The book, again, is How the Word is Passed. You can find it at certainly all the independent bookstores here in Washington. Loyalty Books, I know, is stocking a stack, and we've got a link to the bookshop.org on our website. I recommend it in whatever form, paper, audio, for everybody. And thank you so much for your continuing support of Planet Word and for being with us tonight.
Thanks so much, everybody.